welcome everyone. My name is Kristen Schaefer. I'm the director of CHE, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. I'm zooming in from Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia on Mi'kmaq traditional territory. We invite you to drop a note in the chat introducing yourself and where you're zooming in from if you'd like. Really happy to have you with us today. I'm going to kick us off with a few bits of housekeeping before handing things off to today's moderator. So CHE is a member group of the EDC Strategies Partnership, which is bringing you today's webinar. CHE also hosts science discussion listservs and supports other collaborative programs focused on promoting environmental health and justice. For those of you who called in on the phone, we've posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download the slides by going to today's webinar page, which you'll find the link in the upcoming webinars section of our homepage at healthandenvironment.org. Then click on the slides and resources section of the webinar page. We'll drop the webpage link in the chat for those who are online. We'll disable the chat once we get started so everyone can focus on the presentation, but please do type any questions you have for the speaker in the Q&A box. And we'll, at any point during today's session, and we'll get to as many comments and questions as we can after the presentation. This webinar is scheduled to last for 30 minutes and it's being recorded for our webinar archive. And with that, I'll hand it over to today's moderator, Charles Patton, founder and director of the Biomonitoring Resource Center and co-coordinator of the EDC Strategies Partnership. Charles.
And thank you everybody to joining. Kristen and I have been very busy the past 2 weeks inviting people to join this webinar and telling you all that this really is the most important thing you can do today. So thanks for joining in. Today, Dr. Ian Cousins will discuss the concept of planetary boundaries and his research indicating that the levels of 4 selected perfluoroalkyl acids, or PFAS, in global rainwater, soils, and surface waters are exceeding the recently proposed health guidelines set forth by the United States and some European governments. It's not good news. Ian Cousins has worked at the Department of Environmental Science at Stockholm University since 2002. His research comprises a combination of experimental and modeling approaches to investigate the sources, transport, fate, and exposure of contaminants. And for the past 22 years, he's conducted research primarily on PFAS. Dr. Cousins has published more than 170 peer-reviewed articles and 8 book chapters, and probably the most cited person in terms of PFAS research. In 2020, Professor Cousins kicked off the PFOS 3 project, which is a European-wide multi-partner doctoral research training program in the field of PFAS. He is also an associate editor of the Environmental Science and Technology Journal. Dr. Cousins, I now turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for that nice introduction. When we published this paper at the beginning of August, we didn't expect it to make such a big splash as it did. It was a short perspective in environmental science and technology, and we thought that the results were, of course, interesting, but not super surprising. But it seemed to be very surprising and shocking for many people because there was an enormous, I would call, media tsunami following the publication of this piece. And in the first 12 days after this paper was published, it was downloaded 150,000 times, making it the most downloaded paper in the journal from actually the last year. Now it's got 194,000 downloads. And I had to talk to a lot of journalists, and now there's well over 300 news articles that have been published on this piece. So what was the hypothesis behind this work? Well, we have been noticing for a while that the guidelines that have been set for drinking water and for the environment have been dropping down steadily, to the point where we think that now that the ambient levels in the environment, or kind of the general background levels of PFAS, are now above many of these guidelines. And so that was one of the hypotheses, that for these 4 PFAS, these 4 most well-studied PFAS, that the ambient levels were above the most stringent guidelines and health advisories that have been set. And then we kind of connected this with the planetary boundaries concept. So we sort of said, well, you know, if our basic environmental resources on the planet are contaminated above health advisories, and we can't do much about this, we can't reverse this contamination, then we're actually at a point where we've exceeded the planetary boundary. And I don't know if you know about the planetary boundary concept, but it's something that was also, it comes from my university, Stockholm University as well. It was conceived by Johan Rockström, who's famous in Sweden at least, and he and his colleagues. So the idea is he attempts to estimate the boundaries for safe operating space for humanity. So it's not just for chemicals, there are actually 9 boundaries that he tried to define, and these include some well-known environmental effects like climate change, ozone hole depletion, biodiversity loss, and so on. But one of the 9 planetary boundaries is for chemical pollution, which they now call, also they've redefined, they've renamed it, and they called it novel entities. They renamed it because they wanted to include other man-made things like plastics and nanoparticles, not just chemicals. So I refer to either chemical pollution or the boundary for novel entities. And so basically, if what we said in our hypothesis was that if our basic environmental resources now are contaminated to the point now where, you know, where it's difficult to use like our basic environmental resources because they're so contaminated, then we crossed a planetary boundary. And we also, you know, from the work we've been doing, we think this was a highly predictable problem. You know, we should have been able to see this coming. And as we've said in our work, almost all PFAS are highly persistent chemicals, and that they're persistent under the European regulation, at least. They would all be considered persistent because they are either persistent themselves or they react and degrade into very persistent end products, transformation products, and all PFAS meet those criteria. So all PFAS, or nearly all PFAS, there's a few exceptions, which I won't go into here, but they're all persistent. And if you continually release, and they're also, I should also point out, they're all man-made, they're all synthetic, there's no place for them in the environment, really, they're not supposed to be there. There are no natural sources. If you continually release these persistent man-made chemicals into the environment, what will happen is that they will accumulate in the environment. So the levels will increase. And as they increase over time, then you have increasing probabilities of either known effects or unknown effects occurring. And when you do finally discover an effect, which might be, you know, may take a long time before an effect happens, but when you do discover an effect, there's not much you can do about it because the chemicals are so persistent, you can't easily reverse the contamination or the exposure. So you've got a big problem. And it's not just PFAS this has happened for. We've seen this again and again for many different persistent chemicals or persistent materials. So, you know, we start using them for decades, then we discover a problem, then we spend a few more decades arguing about the problem until we eventually make a global ban on these chemicals, and then they continue to be in the environment long after we ban them. So we've seen that for, and this figure shows this, the different examples with different time points where we discovered the problem. We've actually spent a few decades arguing about it, and then we finally made a global ban of them, and then they continue to be in the environment for DDT, PCBs, CFCs, plastics now, of course, high on the agenda, and PFAS. So I'll just go straight to the main results of the paper. So the big headline, I think a lot of people excited, and it was also in the press release, is that rainwater levels everywhere on the planet are higher than the US EPA drinking water health advisories for PFOA. And they're actually also quite close to the Danish guidelines for the summer for PFAS, which are quite a bit higher than the US EPA guidelines, but there's still the rainwater levels, which are at nanograms per litre, are higher than the Danish guidelines pretty much everywhere as well. And then also, you know, these as well in the paper, it's not just about rainwater, but that seemed to catch most people's attention. It's also about surface waters. You have the similar problem with surface water, where lakes and rivers are the levels are in rainwater and in the lakes and rivers are higher than the environmental quality standard for PFOS, which is set in the European Union. And also, we also noticed that ambient levels of global background levels of soil for these 4 PFAS are higher than the Dutch soil guideline levels. And actually, there's a big problem in the Netherlands because they couldn't build anywhere in the Netherlands. About 70% of building products got cancelled because of the soil contamination. So they ended up having to revise the soil guidelines up by a factor of 10 so they could carry on building. So this is a graphical illustration of the results that was in the paper. So if you look at the top panel, you can see that result from the first bullet on the last slide, that everywhere the rainwater levels are higher than for PFOA are higher than the drinking water guideline, which is the dotted line there at the very bottom of the bar chart. And even for the most remote places on Earth, which are the red bars on the far right, so even for the Tibetan Plateau and for the coastal Antarctica, the levels are way higher in the precipitation there than they are than the guideline. And so the green bars are sort of more sort of like rural areas, and the yellow bars show urban areas, and the blue bar is actually near a fluoropolymer manufacturing plant in China. So if you look in the middle panel, you'll see again for PFOS that again the rainwater levels are mostly above the guidelines, apart from in the most remote areas, and also that the surface water quality standard is also pretty close to the rainwater levels. And in the bottom panel, you can also see that as I said on the previous slide, that the rainwater is pretty close to the Danish drinking water standards for the sum of the 4 PFAS. So those are the same results, but in the graphical display. So I'm just going to try and answer some more, those are the results, but I'm going to try and answer some more questions around this work. So first of all, it's important to point out regarding the levels of PFAS in air, they're actually quite stable. So for the 4 PFAS and also for some of the so-called volatile, what we call precursor chemicals that degrade in the atmosphere and form these 4 PFAS, they've been pretty stable since measurements began. So the levels have not really gone up or gone down. There's kind of inconsistent data, but it's not, they seem to be pretty stable. And we did a literature review, which is the one on the right here, and basically said that for time trends for a whole range of different media, and basically said that in the air, the levels appear to be pretty stable over time. And we don't fully understand why that is, but we do have some theories. So although the rainwater levels have been pretty much constant in the last couple of decades, what has changed is the drinking water guidelines. So that's really what's caused us to suddenly have rainwater levels above the guidelines, because the guidelines have been changing all the time. They've been continuously going downwards. So if you take the first guidelines for PFOA, they were actually 37, they were set in 2002 in the US, they were 37.5 million times higher than the guidelines that were set recently in the summer by the US EPA. So there's been, as we've got better knowledge of toxicity, we have basically decreased the health advisories or drinking water guidelines more and more. And the endpoints have changed. So the critical effect that we base our risk assessment on has changed. It used to be development toxicity, but today it's immunotoxicity. So reduced effectiveness of vaccines in children is driving these guidelines to a really low level. We don't spend a lot of time discussing all of the debates around the guidelines in the paper. We do mention that there is some controversy around where these guidelines are set in different areas of the world. Another important point to mention is that serum levels of PFAS have also declined in the last 20 years. So things were a lot worse 20 years ago, in the sense that our exposure to these chemicals was much higher, and it's declined. So this is for the generally exposed or background population in the US from the NHANES, Center for Disease Control. So this is one of probably the best data set of temporal trends for PFAS in the world. And you can see like a decline for all of these four PFAS that we discussed in the paper. So that's important to bear in mind. So things were a lot worse. Another thing, the question we often get is how are we exposed to PFAS? And I've got an example for PFOS here, but it's pretty similar for the four PFAS that we have in the paper. So actually, drinking water is not the most important exposure route for PFOS. In fact, diet is the most important exposure route. And then house dust, and then air inhalation of these volatile chemicals which degrade in our body to PFOS, and then water, then drinking water. So this is just for the general exposed population, not if you're near a point source. If you're near a military base or something, then of course drinking water is the most important. But just for the, hopefully most of us who are watching, we don't live in these contaminated areas, then we're getting most of our exposure from the diet. And our food is contaminated from the environment generally. So through, fish get their exposure from the water when they're swimming in, and also cows are getting it from the grass that they eat and so on. So it's basically the environment which is ultimately contaminating our food chains. And there are variations depending on the PFAS. So for the shorter chain perfluoroalkyl acids, we get our exposure more from water and vegetables. But for these long chain PFAS that are in the paper there, it's more from the diet and the dust that we get our exposure. So that's important to bear in mind as well in the discussion of this work. Another point is, how did the PFAS get into the rain? I've often asked. And this is a complex question, complex thing to answer, because we don't fully understand it, but there are basically three main pathways, we think. So there's direct emissions especially from fluoropolymer manufacturing, which have released PFAS into the air. Now, this was mostly historical now, because the PFOA is not used in fluoropolymer manufacturing in, say, for example, America anymore. Now it's been replaced with things like GenX and other things. But in China, there's still huge direct emissions of PFOA into the air. That's why you get that big bar on the slide I showed you earlier for PFOA near a fluoropolymer manufacturing site in China. So this direct emissions probably has gone down. So the other two sources are probably the main contributors now. So one of them is these volatile precursor compounds, which are used in lots of consumer products. And now you'll find them in waste streams as well, like in landfills and so on. And these volatilize into the air, and then they degrade in the atmosphere by complicated mechanisms and form things like PFOA and PFOS in the atmosphere, and then these rain out. And then there is this other process, which we're really interested in, because we always thought that the ocean was the final sink of PFAS. But it turns out that through waves, the PFAS can actually be re-emitted on something called sea spray aerosols back into the air. So we have this kind of boomeranging effect, where the chemical gets washed into the sea, and then it gets boomeranged back to the shore on these particles. So these are the three main sources that we think how that for the PFAS into the air and ultimately into the rain. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about this. This is our research that we're doing, trying to understand this toxic boomerang, we call it, this boomeranging effect from the sea back to the land. What's happening here is that when you have waves, it forms bubbles. And because these PFAS are very surface active, they're like detergents. They have a hydrophobic tail and a hydrophilic head. So they go to the interfaces of the bubbles, the bubble films, and get highly enriched on these bubble films. Because they're like super surfactants, they get really enriched on these bubble films. And then when these bubbles come to the surface and burst, they eject these little aerosols, which are called sea spray aerosols or marine aerosols, into the air, and they can then travel a long distance in the atmosphere and come back to land again. We published work on this, and we've done experiments. We generate we've got what we call a sea spray simulator, which simulates this process in the lab so that we can measure the enrichment of these PFAS on these little aerosols and try and determine how important it is as a process. And we see that these PFAS can be enriched by up nearly 100,000 times. It turns out in the latest work, it's about 100,000 times that in the real seawater that these PFAS can get enriched, and depending on the size of the particles, they can travel back to land and contaminate land again, and also obviously contaminate the rainwater. So this we think is a very important mechanism, which is really not well understood at the moment. So to conclude, PFAS are cycling in the global hydrosphere. So our rainwater is contaminated everywhere. Probably we should be really concerned in the long term about our coastal drinking water resources, because this boomerang effect is going to definitely affect those coastal resources for a long, long time to come, because the whole ocean is full of PFAS. Also that these longer chain perfluoroalkyl acids, although they're phased out, they're not declining in the atmosphere, and we don't really understand why, but this is going to prevent health advisories and guidelines from being attained again for a long time to come. All we can do really, because this is background contamination, is just wait until the background contamination declines, and it could take decades. So I guess one of the take-home messages from this paper is like, let's learn from this and learn about problems with persistent chemicals. Beware of the other PFAS doing similar things, for example. Let's finally understand the problems with highly persistent chemicals. And that's what I had to share today. So thank you for your attention. Thanks also to my co-authors that contributed to the work and for the funding.
Thanks very much for this excellent presentation, and we're going to move to some questions and hope we have the time for all that are showing up here. But Dr. Cousins, given what we know about health effects for some of the PFAS and the range of exposures happening globally, why are regulations so hard to pass? Why are the kinds of decisions not being made that would protect us from further PFAS use and any kind of adequate remediation?
Well, I mean, we are data limited, so there's plenty of problems with grouping multiple PFAS together, just because we lack data sometimes. So we have a lot of arguments amongst scientists, for example, about how we should set regulations and what, so we spend a lot of time arguing about all the details. And this, in a way, and then of course there are people with vested interests which are very effective at arguing about all the details as well, which kind of clouds the picture. So I think sometimes we don't set precautionary guidelines quick enough and agree on them quick enough. And it seems to be, that seems to be changing, because I think, I was quite surprised to see how low these US EPA drinking water guidelines were, and also that a lot of other agencies around the world, for example, in Sweden, we also now have decided to use immunotoxicity as the critical effect for the drinking water guidelines, so they also dropped there, in Denmark as well. But there are still problems, like in the EU, we have a very high overall drinking water guideline, which is way higher than these national guidelines that have been set. And the WHO have also recently set a very high drinking water guideline, which I think we should question. Why is that so high? Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's lots of sort of arguments and discussions and about all the details, because there are a lot of details to iron out in doing these risk assessments. And I think sometimes we kind of lose the big picture and remember that we try to protect the public and come to a quick precaution, more precautionary decision.
And the study that you all have done focused on these 4 PFAS. Will you continue the research to look at other depositions of PFAS that might be are probably going on at the same time? For example, are you looking at F gases and the emissions from those?
Well, yeah, regarding, yeah, I mean, we are looking at all the other PFAS. It's just the only reason I limit it, again, it comes back to what I said before. We're data limited. So, well, when I conducted that study, I could say something about those 4 PFAS for sure. Whereas for the other PFAS, we don't have guidelines like for too many PFAS. And so it was hard really to make all the strong conclusions that I made in that paper about many different PFAS. But we have measurements for rainwater and the atmosphere for many more PFAS than I showed in that particular talk. Regarding F gases, yeah, we are thinking about those because I guess that regarding F gases is one of the biggest production volumes of all of the individual PFAS. So it's definitely something where the industry are interested in sort of protecting that particular use going forward. And it's, I think it can be problematic. I mean, traditionally it was like CFCs a long time ago, which made a hole in the ozone layer, and then they switched to other chemicals which were had problems with being strong greenhouse gases. So the latest sort of substitution has been to these perfluorinated olefins, and these also could be problematic because they degrade more readily in the atmosphere, so they don't have the climate global warming potential problems that the old ones had, and they don't have the ozone depleting problems that the CFCs had, but now they degrade into TFA, trifluoroacetic acid, and trifluoroacetic acid is not a very toxic chemical, but there are so many different things which degrade ultimately into TFA, that TFA is now accumulating in rainwater in the same way as the other PFAS I mentioned in this talk. So the levels in rainwater are getting up towards microgram per litre levels in some parts of the world. And okay, they're a lot less toxic, but we can't continue to allow these chemicals to accumulate like that in the long term, because as I mentioned in my talk, ultimately we will find a problem. And then when we have the problem, there's not much we can do about TFA because we can't remove it without treatment technologies from drinking water. So another short chain perfluoroalkyl acids. So in Europe, at least, we're trying to regulate these chemicals which get into our drinking water supplies. These chemicals which cycle in the hydrosphere, the ones like these, like the other PFAS I mentioned earlier. These are ultimately problematic.
Okay. Question, what, if anything, can we do about all the PFAS, et cetera, that have already been released into the environment? Anything we can do about what's already out there?
The ones that are sort of generally spread around the oceans and the atmosphere and so on, no, there's nothing you can do, because you can't clean up the whole ocean and you can't clean up the whole atmosphere. So that, obviously you can't do anything about that. You just have to wait. So that general background contamination, which is now, above the guidelines everywhere, we can't do anything about that. We can only wait. Ultimately, they will dilute into the deep oceans, but it's going to take decades. There's not much we can do. We can clean up point sources, and there are really good technologies being developed where we can clean up a lot of these really contaminated point source areas, and there's lots of work going on that. So I think that should continue, and we should continue to look for better methods cleaning up all these historical problems. And we need to have, we need to double it. In some countries, they're not making the same efforts as they are in others. So we need to make sure that these efforts go on in many different parts of the world, and to remove these hotspots. And of course, China is a massive problem. We have to do something about the continuous release of some of these really problematic PFAS, like PFOA, for example, is still being emitted in massive amounts in China. And it doesn't stay in China. It gets emitted into the oceans and the atmosphere, and then goes around the whole world. So we have to stop doing that. We're importing products from China that are made with PFOAs. So that's also an ethical issue. Some of the fluoropolymers that we import into the US or Europe are made with PFOA.
Mm-hmm. just so you know, people are writing in and saying they're very grateful for this presentation and they're learning a great deal from it. So a lot of applause for you. Can you talk more about food as a being a source of exposure? Do we know if exposure is greater through crops, meat, or milk? Is there a particular food?
Yeah, when it depends on the PFAS. Like I said before, for the ones I talked about, these long chain ones, which set most of the guidelines for, that we have studied the most, like PFOS and PFOA and hexane sulfonate and PFNA. We get them mainly from the food, and the exposure comes mainly from the food. And it's particularly for, at least for PFOS and PFNA, it's mostly from protein-rich foods. So fish, meat, dairy, those kind of protein-rich eggs, very protein-rich foods are the ones where we get most of our exposure. But if you go to a lot of the alternatives that come out, like Genix and so on, they're much more water-soluble. They get taken up by plant roots and get into plants. So for those, vegetables become relatively more important. So a lot of when they switch from the long chain to the short chain, they switch the exposure more to drinking water and to vegetables. So the newer alternatives, the exposure comes mostly from the drinking water and vegetables, whereas for the older ones, it's more from the diet, protein-rich foods, where the exposure came from.
Okay. And then you mentioned the PFAS, some PFAS being taken up by plants. Would that be true for, there's been some research that PFAS has been taken up into trees and their needles and branches and leaves. So when those burn in forest fire, would you expect PFAS to be released into the atmosphere from wildland urban interface fires? Those fires don't tend to burn as hot as an incinerator would burn in terms of trying to burn.
So I understand this, that the PFAS contaminates the plant leaves and needles, and that they could get released from during a fire or something.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. Well, actually, I think that the leaves and the needles get mostly contaminated. It depends on the PFAS, but for the things like the legacy PFAS, the longer chain ones like PFOS, they would get into the needles mostly from the air, not from the roots. For the short chain PFAS, on the other hand, they would come up through the roots and get into the leaves and the needles in that way. I don't think that a forest fire would be a major source of, it wouldn't be a major problem in terms of PFAS. There are other pollution issues that you should worry about with a big fire. The pHs in particular, nasty toxic chemicals, which are going to be produced in lots of really high quantities when you have a forest fire.
We're running out of time here, but I'll
No.
A couple other questions. You mentioned the DAG exposure is contaminated from the environment. How does that compare to exposure from non-stick food packaging like fast food wrappers and microwave popcorn bags?
Yeah, I mean, historically, I think that the exposure from food contact materials was very high. And it could be the reason why why a lot of us got PFAS into our blood, us that lived through the 1990s. At that time, PFAS were in lots of food contact materials. So they were in candy wrappers, butter wrappers, any kind of food contact materials where you wanted to protect food, fats from going through paper or going through your fast food papers onto your jeans, and stuff like that. So it was really used widely back in the day. But the paper industry and the whole industry has really learned a lesson and changed their way. So currently, I don't think it's a major exposure route compared to what it was, but historically it was a really important exposure route and can account for a lot of the exposure that we got historically. But I think, and also when you talk about Teflon pan, that's also something which has changed, so that the industry now clean up the PTFE before they put it coat it onto a frying pan or something, so that you will not get exposure from the cooking your eggs or whatever from the pan these days, because the levels are extremely low in the PTFE. But there are problems with PTFE from a life cycle viewpoint. So when you make PTFE, you release a lot of nasty things. And when you dispose of PTFE, you also release a lot of nasty things. From a life cycle perspective, PTFE has still got a lot of issues. But I think the issue regarding exposure during cooking is not as big as it was in the past again. So the food contact materials certainly is probably very important historically, but not as important today.
Okay, and then one final question. The information you presented today is very powerful, and it seems that it should be used well to enforce tighter regulations in terms of use, transport, and disposal. How best would you suggest we move this whole issue of PFAS tighter regulations forward using this information? Where's the best route for us to take this kind of information?
Well, I think there's lots of activities going on to try and regulate PFAS as a class, and I think that it's well founded on the sense that all of these chemicals are man-made and persistent, and that we have shown historically that this is a problem. Of course, PFAS are extremely diverse, so not all PFAS are the same. Not all PFAS are equally toxic. And they have, some of them will be in the atmosphere and some of them will be in the water. Some of them are just polymers. But I don't think that we can say that just that some are non-problematic, because all of them are persistent. And I think what we see is a diversity of different problems emerging because of their diversity of properties, combined with their high persistence. So we see things like greenhouse gas warming, ozone depletion, we see toxic effects, we see microplastic particles, we see all sorts of different things for individual PFAS, all related to their high persistence. So I think that there is definitely a motivation for phasing out the uses of PFAS where they're not really essential in society. So I would like to see that going forward, that we just restrict the uses of PFAS where we really need to have them, and really think carefully about where we need them, and phase them out when we don't need them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been an hour asking these all these questions, and we will be sending to you the questions we didn't get to, and if you have time, perhaps you can respond to them. And I think you mentioned the document that you had before the questions, so we'll circulate that as well. So thanks a lot again. I really, really appreciate this. And I'm going to turn this back over now to Kristen to bring it to a formal close.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you so much, Dr. Cousins, for sharing this important work. And as Cheryl mentioned, you had said you have a FAQ that you put together, and so we'll look at put that up on our webpage and see if we can circulate that to all the participants in today's webinar. So I have just a few quick announcements as we wrap up. First, I wanted to let you all know that a video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and everyone who registered for today's session will receive an email containing a link to that video. And I'm sharing in the chat right now a link to the webpage for our PFAS Science and Policy series, which may be of interest. And also just wanted to remind people to keep an eye out for details on the next EDC Strategies Partnership call in November. You'll find details on the CHE website at healthandenvironment.org as soon as they're available. And then I also wanted to share that this is CHE's 20th year, and we're marking the anniversary in various ways, including a series of online informal conversations with leading researchers and innovators in the field of environmental health and justice that we're calling the CHE Cafes. And the next cafe will bring together some researchers on cancer and the environment, and that'll be on Wednesday, October 19th. At 10 a.m. Pacific time, and I'll drop that link in the chat as well for anyone who's interested. And we'll also be hosting a hybrid in-person online gathering at Commonweal to mark CHE's 20th year on Saturday, November 12th. All are welcome to join us. You'll find a link to details about this event on the CHE homepage, healthandenvironment.org. And finally, we encourage you to support the work of any and all of the groups involved in the EDC Strategies Partnership. You'll find links to each group on CHE's partnerships page. And if you appreciate these webinars, please consider a tax-deductible donation to CHE and/or any of these partners. And with that, I would like to thank again our speaker, Dr. Cousins, for taking time to share these findings with us today. Thanks to Charles for your always excellent moderation, and to my colleague, Sarah Howard of HEEDS for her behind the scenes technical support today. And finally, many thanks to all of you for joining us.